Brock glanced up from the soil before him, only to receive a harsh lash of a whip for daring to look at his superiors. He disregarded the acute, stinging sensation spreading across his back and grinned. He had spotted the bird once more. The bird that had been trailing him ever since his village was destroyed, ever since he had been turned into an elven thrall. The small stream of blood trickling down his back could be disregarded, as long as he knew something was watching over him. Being an uneducated Westerling, he had little idea what the bird was or what it might want from him. The only things that made sense to him were the tales told by his village's bard about great heroes and legends of the gods. The gods always kept watch over their favored humans and would demonstrate their approval by sending a raven to watch over them. At least, that was how Brock recalled it. He wasn't certain if the bird was actually a raven or not, but he presumed it was. It was all he had left now. Before him lay the remnants of his village, and numerous others all subjugated under the Imperium's rule. The captives, around 1,000 in number, had been compelled to trek from their homeland to this place, the Sylph's crown jewel, the Citadel. As he finally passed through the city gates, Brock chanced one last look upward, beholding the breathtaking spires and white towers scattered across the vast expanse before him. The Citadel was where every noteworthy mage had studied and graduated, and here he was. Naturally, Brock had never possessed magical abilities, being human, but he was still struck with awe by the sheer display of grandeur, might, and architectural prowess that lay before him. A yelled command from the slave master made his eyes drop back down, but the image was seared into his memory. A magnificent fortress of the Sylphs, constructed through the labor of slaves like himself. The simmering anger within his chest flared a bit stronger because of that. They had reached the market. He, along with the other human slaves like himself, were guided into a pen. One after another they were summoned to the auction block. When Brock took his position on the block, there was a faint gasp from parts of the crowd. Most of the slaves and villagers who had been called up were simple farm workers, elderly men, and youngsters. Brock was a different case entirely. Son of the deceased Jarl's personal guard, he had been brought up to fight, not to tend fields. Standing at an impressive 6'2", he would have matched the height of most of the taller and more elegant elves around him, had he been allowed to stand upright. However, unlike the elves who guarded him and held him in chains, he was not slim, light, and graceful. He was muscle. Every part of him was filled with strength, and although weakened by the journey and poor food, he was still a remarkable specimen. The bidding began much higher to reflect this vast difference. Nevertheless, it wasn't his stature or might that caught the attention of the bidders and spectators. It was the fact that he didn't slouch, defeated, gazing at the ground. He looked up at the sky, as if seeking something. And when his youthful eyes spotted that bird, a small yet wild smile appeared on his face. The different yelled prices increased somewhat above the initial bid, but not one came close to what the slave master desired. He might attempt to sell Brock as much as he wished, yet the reality persisted that nobody wanted a slave who was capable of and likely to end their life. At last, after several minutes, a powerful, clear voice called out from the crowd. It parted to reveal the most arrogant elf that Brock had ever seen. Granted, he hadn't encountered many, but this self-proclaimed Lord Protector took the prize. Clad in long, dark red flowing robes, he walked in as if he owned the place. Offering 2,000 imperial ducats for Brock, a significant increase compared to other bidders, the slave master eagerly handed over the chain to this new elf. Brock and this Lord Protector locked eyes for a tense moment, the crowd watching with bated breath. Would this fierce human break free and try to attack one of the most powerful battle mages the city had known? A full minute into the standoff, Brock laughed, a rough barking sound, and decided to follow behind this pompous elf. He wasn't the smartest, but he knew better than to start a fight he couldn't win. Beyond the crowd's reach and earshot, the elf spoke once more. Now you need to understand this. I've acquired you to serve as protection for my daughter. This here. At this point, the elf summoned a blue mystical collar around the regular iron one. Will ensure that she stays safe. If anything harmful were to befall her, I swear I'll make you regret ever being born. Do you comprehend, you slow-witted human?" Brock, a bit superstitious, gave a nod, not wishing to interfere with whatever mystical powers this odd elf appeared to possess. Unable to comprehend the elven language, he had no idea what had just been asked of him. Nevertheless, he grasped the unspoken threat in the words. As he followed his new master, he began to ponder what his existence would be like among these sylphs. Lyra glanced around her new dorm, pleased with its appearance. She had devoted most of the day to tidying it up and preparing for her first year at the Citadel, reviewing her books, practicing spells, and doing more cleaning. Sighing contentedly at a task well completed, she heard a knock at the door. Upon opening it, she saw her father. "Daddy, thank you for coming." Wrapping her arms around him, she embraced him for quite a few moments before eventually releasing her hold. Gesturing for him to enter her dorm, she was a bit taken aback by the being that trailed behind. "What is that? Have you bought another human? Why is he here?" Lord Arryn raised a hand to prevent any further inquiries from his readily enthusiastic daughter. "Now just give an old elf a moment to adjust. This here is your new human. I purchased him at the market today and made certain to get the largest, sturdiest one I could find. He's here to protect you, and I've cast several wards around him to ensure he doesn't cause you harm. Just be sure you're safe, all right?" At this moment, Lord Arryn gave a bittersweet smile, feeling sorrow at his daughter's departure, yet joyful that she had at last reached the destination of her dreams. "Oh, thank you, Dad. I promise I'll look after myself. Don't you worry. You really shouldn't have." Father and daughter embraced once more before he went off. "I love you, Lyra. Promise to come and visit me." "Of course, I wouldn't dream not to." Brock observed the interaction before him uneasily, feeling uncomfortable at the joy and affection displayed in front of him. The elves had killed his family and father, yet here they were enjoying themselves and expressing their love. He quietly scoffed to himself. He pondered if they realized their hypocrisy, but concluded that they likely did not. Shifting his weight, Brock wondered what his role would be. He was relieved that he wouldn't be in the mines or a similar place, but concerned about what he would be doing here. All Brock was familiar with was combat and fighting. Having to adapt to becoming some dainty elf girl's servant would not be pleasant. The initial week of classes passed by, followed by the second and then the third. Lyra had formed so many new friendships that recalling all their names proved challenging. A handful of the other girls possessed protectors, but only one or two had humans as guards, and none of the other humans came close to matching the size of hers. The other humans actually seemed somewhat intimidated by hers, occasionally giving slight bows in his direction. Lyra had chosen to name her mostly quiet slave Bobber, after a cat she'd owned when she was younger. Life continued on, and it was pleasant. It took Brock a while to adjust to his new life. He still worked out when he was sure the elf girl wasn't watching, and practiced some of his axe and sword moves with a stick he had come across, but none of it felt the same. The two other humans he had met were simple peasants from the lands that Brock came from, and they recognized the young man as the son of a Huskarl to the Jarl, not some random commoner. Life was not pleasant. It was dull, frustrating, and foolish. He had to wait around while the elf girl attended halls, where some old elf would drone on in that strange language of theirs, making silly drawings. He despised it. Nevertheless, he was still somewhat afraid of the elf mage who had threatened him to attempt anything. Lyra was thrilled. She'd been asked out by some of her new friends to a tavern close to the Citadel, and she was all set for a girls' night out. Donning her favorite corset and dress, a vibrant red, she set off to meet her friends. The evening was fantastic, drinking with her pals, chatting about the people at her school, and flirting with the various handsome guard captains that frequented the tavern. After a long night out, the three friends stumbled away from the inn, singing among themselves and dancing in the dark, nearly deserted streets. After quite a bit of wandering, they found themselves in an area of town that they scarcely recognized. A little worried, they turned around to head back, only to be confronted by several rough-looking sylphs, wearing ragged clothes and wielding makeshift knives and shivs. As none of the girls knew combat spells, they huddled together in a group, turning the other way, only to find it blocked off by another band of rough sylphs. Lyra's two friends held their protectors on leashes, but they knew it wouldn't be enough. Brock was furious. First, that elf woman had forced him to trek all the way out here, then he had to endure the irritating and snobbish elven laughter from inside the tavern while he waited outside. No drinks for the human. He let out a sigh, glancing at his companions outside the inn, the other two elf-girl guardians. An odd lizard whose primary function was to lounge on his mistress's cushions and appear plump, and a peculiar entity. It resembled a squid, yet it hovered in the air and emitted light. Brock already despised it. At last, after enduring hours on the chilly, unyielding cobblestones, the elf girls had emerged, thoroughly intoxicated, likely from some brew that would scarcely pass as alcohol in his homeland. With another sigh, Brock trailed behind them, feeling bored and irritated every step of the way. His head lowered, he began to doze off while walking. A scream from one of the girls caused his head to snap back up. He observed the 5 sylphs on one side and the 6 on the other, clutching objects that appeared to be makeshift knives. A broad, lethal smile spread across his face. At last, some excitement. Lyra felt frightened. She was well aware of what these undercity sylphs would do to someone like her, and it was far from pleasant. She attempted to search her mind for any idea, anything at all, that might assist her, even looking towards her supposed guardian. The moment she glanced at him, she let out a cry, feeling her leather leash connected to his collar suddenly break in two. Brock bellowed the battle cry of his ancestors, the battle cry of his father, the battle cry of his homeland. He had no weapons, but that hardly mattered. All he saw was the enemy, and all he felt was the thrill of battle. He charged into the first elf he spotted, slamming him into the stone wall behind. He heard something crack when the elf hit the wall, and figured that was a job well done. A sharp, stinging pain in his back made him whirl around. Though Brock was not as tall as the elf who had just stabbed him, his shoulders and arms were easily twice as thick. His bright blue eyes flashing with rage, dagger still lodged in his back, he hoisted up the elf before him. Lifting the elf above him with a fierce roar, Brock brought him down on his knee with a resounding and sickening snap. Flinging the body aside, he charged towards the remaining cutpurses, bellowing out his war cry. Seizing one elf by the neck, the one who seemed to be their leader, he lifted him high above the throng. 2 strikes shot out from his muscular yet surprisingly quick arm, and 2 more elves fell onto the cobblestones. Still clutching the elf leader by his throat, blood trickling down his arm from the wounds inflicted on it, Brock hurled him into the remaining sylphs rushing towards him. The rest of the former Undercity dwellers took one glance at the blood-covered man and decided that it wasn't worth whatever meager ransom or money they might obtain. They fled, with Brock's deep, mocking laughter trailing after them. Lyra gazed in terror at her guardian, multiple blades protruding from his blood-soaked form, a savage and untamed smile on his face, and a chilling laugh emanating from his throat. She collapsed into the arms of her similarly terrified classmates. The next day, Lyra opened her eyes in bed, her father's worried expression hovering above her. She quickly sat upright, blinking to clear her vision. What happened? Your companions dispatched someone from the watch to fetch me after you lost consciousness. You're fortunate to be out of harm's way. I was extremely concerned for your well-being. I don't understand. Who brought me back? The human I purchased you from. He preserved your life, Lyra. He saved your life and those of your companions. As much as I dislike admitting it, but you and I both owe a great deal to that young man. Where is he now? I want to see him. Lyra got up from her bed in the infirmary. She hadn't actually been injured during last night's events, just frightened, and would have been experiencing quite the hangover, if not for the healing spells applied to her by the medics. Outside the infirmary sat her human, with a few bandages on him, appearing bored and irritated at the elf who was attempting to care for him. Father, is it truly right to use the non-magical races as servants? After all, he did rescue me from danger last night. And for that, he deserves recognition among his people. However, you need to realize, daughter, that these humans are scarcely more than beasts, dwelling in their primitive shelters and caverns. It falls to us to bring them civilization. Don't trouble your lovely mind about it any further. You're out of harm's way, and that's what's truly important. Lyra nodded, agreeing with her father, yet still experienced a slight unease as she had the human escorted back to her dormitory. She became aware that she hadn't truly attempted to communicate with her quiet guardian and decided to address that issue. Brock consumed the peculiar meat that was offered to him, pondering its origin, but ultimately deciding it didn't matter. He had managed to slay some sylphs, and although they weren't his enslavers or his father's killers, he felt satisfied. He glanced up to see the elf girl enter the room, carrying an unusual book in her hands. She opened it, and after perusing some passage in it multiple times, gestured at herself. Speaking in heavily accented Western, she uttered in his language, "I am Lyra, thank you. What is your name?" Brock simply gazed, uncertain how to respond to his captor. After a few minutes, just as the girl, Lyra, appeared ready to shut the book and abandon her efforts, he parted his lips. "Sir Brock, I'm Brock." And with that, the first step into an actual conversation was taken. Lord Protector Aldrich, Battle Mage Primus of the Imperium, and commander of the 3rd Legion, let out a sigh of defeat. He gazed down at the map spread on the table before him, attempting to decipher what he observed. It was a map of the city and citadel, with particular locations marked by red darts. String linked these darts, forming a seemingly nonsensical pattern above the map. Leaning back in his chair, Aldrich sighed once more, fatigued. First the conflict along the western border, and now this, whatever this might be. He still wasn't certain. The commander of the watch had forwarded him these documents and records of offences across the city, various break-ins, thefts, and crimes. The commander had been convinced that they signified something, and that there was some grand plot behind it all, but Aldrich couldn't quite see it. Of course, that didn't mean it wasn't present, which was the reason for his staying up all night to try and unravel it. He pounded the desk in his exasperation, struggling to comprehend it all. The guards outside his chambers startled at the noise, exchanging uneasy looks. It wouldn't be the first instance of the Lord Protector flying into a rage, but neither of them wished to be present when it occurred. Brock was standing outside the lecture hall, resting against the wall. He could hear that dull old codger of a professor droning on about something in that irritating language of the sylphs from inside. He glanced at the sole other human waiting there with him. "Garrett, right? That's what you said your name was?" Garrett, the other older human, nodded. "You've got it right. Garrett Oakenstump at your service, and you're Brock, Ragnar's son, aren't you? I recall spotting you around the Longhouse when I went to pay tithe. My, you've grown quite a bit since those days. Nice to see someone from our fiefdom about. I figured they'd killed all those too old to march, but seems you proved them wrong." Garrett let out a light wheezing laugh. They'd need to put in more effort than that to finish me off. I reckon they appreciated my spirit, because now I'm stuck here with you, guarding these foolish elves. Well, I suppose you're the nearest thing we've got to a Jarl now, after those thrice-cursed slavers did away with the previous one. It's a shame they made off with the crown as well. Garrett, how many humans do you reckon are in the citadel? I know there's you and me, and I believe I spotted another one earlier, but there must be more around the kitchens or other servants, wouldn't you think? My guess is as good as yours, but I could try to inquire around. Why? Surely you don't believe a rebellion would succeed against the crown jewel of elven magics? With a slightly embarrassed expression, Brock disclosed the object he was holding. It was a knife, a keepsake from when he had rescued Lyra. He had concealed it during the medical checkup, and now carried it with him constantly. By the sunken sailor, what's the matter with you, Brock? Listen, I understand you're angry that they killed your Da, but you'd be crazy to try and rebel in here. Perhaps if you escaped outside you could do something, but unless the Eastlanders come together, you know as well as I do that we can't do anything. Put that away before you get us both killed. Look, you just have to accept that us humans don't have magic. None. Zero. Nothing. And these sylphs, magic is what they are. Hell, some even believe that they're our gods. You know I despise them as much as you do. It's just that, well, we can't do anything about it. Muttering in frustration, Brock concealed his knife once more. He gave a nod, not entirely convinced, but reluctant to further provoke an elder like Garrett. In the lecture hall, Lyra sat leaning forward in her seat, attentively listening to Professor Dawnstar's lesson on the different types of magic. Usually this class wouldn't be particularly engaging, but today he was covering something unique, forgotten magics. She carefully kept her notes organized as she paid attention to his lecture. Now you must understand, most of these types of magics have been absent for hundreds of years. As many of you likely know, magic is transmitted through the bloodline. However, there are exceptions. I know, that sounds like blasphemy, but allow me to explain. When I mentioned there are exceptions, I meant there is a single exception: mage breakers. None of our records inform us what species these abominations belong to, as much of our knowledge about them was lost during the burning of the first citadel. However, all of the surviving books and scrolls concur that these mage breakers were not only resistant to all forms of magic used against them, but could actively suppress other mages' powers, even to the extent of shattering the enemy mage's mind. Thus the name. However, what made these creatures truly terrifying is how they came to be. We know very little about the process, except that it involved some kind of dark offering to a deceased god, whose name has been forgotten by history. Professor Dawnstar went on discussing other forgotten magics, but Lyra had already begun daydreaming and sketching about these mage breakers. She wasn't sure why, but the concept both thrilled and frightened her, much like those old tales her nanny used to share. She only glanced up when her friend, Celeste, nudged her with her charcoal stick. While Lyra was tall for a human, Celeste was even taller. She stood at an impressive 7'0", looming over humans and some sylphs alike. Lyra always considered Celeste more beautiful than herself too, with long flowing blonde hair and a perfect complexion, unlike Lyra's dark black hair and scattered freckles. Lyra, hi Lyra, what's your plan for this afternoon? A few of the girls and I are heading to the ruins near the lake. Would you like to join us? Lyra grinned. Bobbing her head in assent, she began gathering her things into her satchel as the professor concluded. At last, a chance to escape from the tedious lessons that typically burdened her. Brock glanced around the ruins nervously. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something felt peculiar about them. Not in a negative way, as Brock actually felt rather good while wandering about their stone walls. Of course, he mused, that could also be due to the several scantily clad elf girls currently splashing around in the lake. Gazing up at the sky, Brock spotted the bird that had trailed him to this accursed city. That lifted his spirits somewhat, as he still had something keeping an eye on him. He proceeded to walk up the rocky path into the nearby forest, some mysterious force preventing him from venturing too far from the campsite. Brock carried a wood-cutting axe in his hand, having been tasked with gathering firewood for the sylphs. Lyra had been kind enough to give him instructions in his own language, but that didn't change the fact that he remained her slave. Hearing some rustling near a pile of stones that once formed a wall, Brock froze. He wasn't scared of anything in these woods, but it had been quite a while since he'd eaten some real meat, not that odd stuff the elves provided him. Crouching there, motionless, he watched a rabbit hop out of the bushes. The rabbit seemed to have elk antlers growing from its head, but that hardly fazed Brock. It looked mostly like a rabbit, moved like a rabbit, and he figured it would taste like rabbit. Carefully raising the axe, he readied himself to strike. It wasn't a battle axe, and it wasn't balanced for throwing, but Brock had always dominated the axe-throwing contests in his village. He felt pretty sure he could hit a plump little horned rabbit. Without even a sigh, he hurled the axe, which slammed into the rabbit and the stones behind it, its small amount of blood seeping into the earth. He rose, walked over, and prepared to retrieve the axe, hoping it wasn't too blunted by the impact. Well, it's not a lot, but it is a servant of the horned one, so I'll accept it. Besides, it's been ages since one of your kind offered a sacrifice to me. Brock whirled around, gripping the axe in his hands, prepared to swing at whoever uttered those words. Gazing into the dimming forest, he spotted no one. Just as he was about to call out a challenge, the odd bodiless voice spoke once more. It sounded ancient, more ancient than Brock could even fathom. "That's not a proper way to treat your host, although I confess I haven't made much effort to welcome you as my guest, so—" In front of Brock stood a being, clad from head to toe in spiked metal armor, with an unpolished iron crown atop its helmeted head. The being took a step forward, extending its hand in greeting. "Don't tell me your kind has already forgotten about me. It's only been, what, 8 centuries or so. I'm just here to lend a hand, and judging by that collar around your neck, you might need it. Now, I've been keeping an eye on your journey to this dump those sylphs call a city, and I must say I'm impressed. Little Alex here has filled me in on all about you, isn't that right?" Upon this, the armor-clad spectre permitted the bird to alight on his shoulder, stroking it softly with a metal-encased finger. For reasons unknown to him, Brock somehow sensed that it was the identical bird that had been trailing him. "Is there nothing you wish from me? No assistance I can provide to the one who has made the first offering in ages?" Brock wasn't certain what to think of the creature standing before him, but he gripped his axe tightly nonetheless. He had never encountered such a being before, but, having grown up in a small village, he was unfamiliar with many things. Still, he reasoned that his situation couldn't really deteriorate much further, and so he gave a nod. "My name is Brock Ragnarsson, and I want revenge." The creature before him nodded. "Indeed, that is a noble cause. I am the Steel Emperor, and I desire to be recognized once again as the guardian of humanity, and I think that we might be able to assist one another in this matter." The Steel Emperor lifted a hand, and Brock started to feel an itching across his chest and shoulders. Blue runes shimmered in the light of the setting sun, and Brock sensed a surge of energy course through him. Raising his hand to examine it, Brock observed how these lines of runes now covered his body, gleaming with an ancient power. As quickly as it began, the itching sensation and the glow ceased. No markings adorned his body, but Brock felt altered. Looking up, he saw the Steel Emperor disappearing before him. "Summon my raven if you desire to converse with me once more. Lacking devotees, I have become feeble, and your benediction has drained much of my lingering strength. Depart now, and employ it judiciously." Gripping his wood axe tightly, Brock could only gaze at the vanishing phantom before him. Collecting the wood he had gathered, he made his way back down the path to the campsite, just as twilight was setting in. He wasn't certain what he had been gifted with, but he needed to maintain his cover for now. However, when the time came, Brock would be prepared. Lord Protector Aldrich furrowed his brow as he sensed an unusual fluctuation in the magical energies surrounding the city. Although it wasn't uncommon for magical practices to occur at this late hour, it was certainly peculiar. Dismissing it as some eccentric citadel experiment, he returned his attention to examining the map. The Lord Protector felt he was on the cusp of a breakthrough, and he wasn't prepared to abandon his efforts just yet. Lyra and Celeste observed as the human readied their fire, splitting wood and creating kindling. Resting idly in the fading sunlight, they gazed through the sparks at the muscular man before them, his biceps tensing and perspiration trickling down his bare chest. Lyra glanced at Celeste, a query forming on her lips. "Celeste, you are aware that we've got plenty of wood for the fire, aren't you? There's no need to have the slave do it for us." Celeste nodded absent-mindedly, still staring at Brock's bare chest. Yeah, but I mean the view is pretty nice." Lyra let out a sigh at her occasionally superficial friend, then summoned Brock. Using the language of the Eastlanders, she issued him a command. "Brock, I think we've got enough wood now so you can stop chopping. Thanks for your help." Brock simply nodded at her. He rarely ever spoke in reply to her instructions, but she always attempted to communicate in his language to him. Poor brute. She did ponder if there was a hidden intelligence behind those blue eyes, yet anyone she mentioned it to would dismiss that as imagination. Nevertheless, out here in the ruins with her closest companion, she chose to express her grievances. "Celeste, have you ever considered that the non-magical races might be more than just savage brutes? What if our judgment of them has been wrong? Is it truly justified to enslave them?" Her fair-haired companion turned away from the flames and back towards her, concern visible in her vivid green eyes. Well, I suppose I've never really considered it. I mean, there are always a couple of groups that talk about that sort of thing back in the capital, but I've never pondered it myself. Why do you ask? Do you think that, he—" At this point she gestured towards Brock. "Is more intelligent than he's showing, or—" Sighing, Lyra leaned back. "Well, I'm not sure. It's just been on my mind recently. I mean, after all, he did rescue both of us 2 weeks back." Celeste straightened up, her eyes sparkling. Lyra recognized that this signaled she had come up with an idea. If it was a good one or not, that was yet to be determined. "Lyra, I've got an idea." Lyra sighed once more, her suspicions validated. "Teach me his language. I know you understand it, but if we can both speak it and inquire about his thoughts on it, perhaps we could comprehend him better. I've got some paper from my notes with me. We could perform like interviews or something with him. Determine if he truly is a savage or not." "Celeste, okay, I suppose that's actually not the worst idea you've had. The only issue is that he doesn't appear to enjoy conversation. Let's begin tomorrow so we can be refreshed and properly awake for it." Celeste nodded, feeling excited. She turned towards the fire and pointed a finger at it, willing it to extinguish. She frowned as the flames continued to burn. However, on her second attempt at pointing at it, her magic took effect. Shrugging, Celeste wondered if she had done the spell incorrectly the first time and then went to sleep. Brock grinned as Celeste struggled to extinguish the fire. He had been experimenting with the new sensations within himself, implanted by that steel emperor. Like exercising a muscle in his mind, he observed how the magic appeared to falter, if only slightly. This might come in handy, he mused, before choosing to heed his body's suggestion and drift off to sleep. A thick midnight fog blanketed the street and alley, hovering above the cobblestones like an ethereal stream. The sparse lanterns on this road emitted only faint illumination, their keen, cold beams cutting through the nocturnal mist. Lord Protector Aldrich stood concealed behind a structure, bastard sword and magic at the ready. Behind him waited 5 city guardsmen, each clad in plate armor and each possessing some skill in the arcane arts. Before them stood a warehouse, seemingly dark and vacant. Yet beneath one of the shut doors, a small pool of light seeped out. To the casual observer, it was insignificant. However, to the Lord Protector, it was everything. After countless sleepless nights, he and the commander of the guard had at last traced these thieves to what they suspected was their hideout. Across the street, the commander waited with his elite warriors, anticipating Aldrich's signal. After exhaling a breath laden with adrenaline, the Lord Protector stepped forward and kicked open the door. Flames licked around his dark crimson robes, wings of pure heat and fire emerging from his back. The Lord Protector resembled something from a terrible dream. Yet what had startled him, after bursting through the door, was his adversary. A massive bird skull atop its head, shrouded entirely in pitch-black robes, with armor crafted from enchanted bone clattering as it turned, the Lord Protector confronted a being from nightmares. Something no elf would ever wish to encounter, something from the deepest, darkest terrors of every tale. The Lord Protector stood face to face with a lich. Brock stood beneath a tree observing his ward and her fellow students practice. Today's lesson was a music class, one that Brock had never had the chance to fully experience. The enchanted elven melodies drifted through the air, producing visible ripples and hues with each fresh note. Their instruments conjured into being through magic, every string working in harmony with the others to create a beautiful melody. Yet the true focal point was the choir, 30 elves, Lyra among them, whose soaring voices reached towards the heavens, intertwining to form a wild, otherworldly tune. This symphony was unparalleled in the Imperium, and it was one of the Citadel's greatest privileges to be part of it. It's a bit shit in it. Brock turned to Garrett, who was standing beside him. He nodded. I mean, this magical stuff is all well and good, but compared to the ram's horns and war drums before an attack? Brock trembled, recalling his first raid. Despite his young age of only 23 winters, he had experienced numerous raids. Each time the horns sounding in the early morning air, the ships coming ashore, he had nearly forgotten how exhilarating it felt. Now he was trapped here, unless he could somehow activate that peculiar blessing or curse. Brock had attempted to use it several times since the initial occurrence, but could never quite get it to function consistently. He knew he ought to keep it secret, but he reasoned that if anyone knew about it, Garrett would. After all, he had been among the oldest villagers, and had even known the wise man before he had attained that title. Hey, Garrett. Brock trailed off, not sure how to bring it up. Yes? You know how occasionally there are these things that you can't really explain, but they're within you, and you feel like trying them out. Completely deadpan, Garrett turned to Brock and replied, Those are emotions, Brock. Brock sighed, exasperated. No, I mean like, as a hypothetical, suppose you received some kind of gift from, let's say, just as an example, some ancient forgotten deity, and you could sort of, make it so people in your vicinity couldn't use magic. Hypothetically speaking, how would you go about doing something like that? Wait, hold on. Are you saying that one of the Forgotten Ones has bestowed upon you the ability to halt magic? Is this some kind of joke? Garrett chuckled, attracting a few irritated glances from the elves at the fringes of the symphony. He toned it down, but couldn't erase the broad smile from his face. Oh boy, you're serious, aren't you? Well, this changes everything. Why, we might even be able to hold out for more than 5 minutes during your little uprising. But, if I'm understanding this correctly, you don't even know how to fully control this anti-magic ability. Thinking back to some of the old tales, I believe there were maybe 1 or 2 legends about this sort of thing. All I can recall about those was that the hero perished in the end, so I don't think they'll be of much use to you. Brock appeared defeated, slumping down to rest against the rough bark of the oak tree at his back. Don't worry, Brock, we'll work something out. We can try to practice whenever you're able to slip away. I've also managed to count the number of human slaves in here, and I believe there are about 753 of us, including ourselves. We'll come up with a plan, so don't you fret. Brock worried. Lyra was in her second class of the day, which happened to be her least favorite, theology. All mages were required to have some knowledge of it, though she couldn't understand why. As far as she was concerned, it was sufficient that they existed. She didn't particularly care about their origins. Professor Thorne carried on with his lecture. The world was once young, just as you and I were. In this early time there existed Kronos, who dwelled deep in the depths, the god of land, stone, and earth. He felt lonely, for the land was barren, and no living thing walked upon Kronos' domain. Then came Terra. She was beautiful. She embodied life and nature, and she was not of Kronos. She brought vitality to this barren land of Kronos', sowing it with plants and populating these newly grown forests and plains with all manner of fantastical creatures. Together, Kronos and Terra presided over this new earth, allowing Terra's creations to thrive among the wild and untamed landscape. Nevertheless, even the gods were unable to prevent discord from emerging among them, and what had begun as a trivial dispute over something now forgotten escalated into what we currently recognize as the War of the Gods. In the depths of Kronos' great foundry, upon the anvil of creation, he crafted his army. Formed from stone, steel, and flame, the first dwarves emerged. Stout, strong, and sturdy, like their maker, they marched out of the great foundry, equipped by Kronos himself, bestowed with the mighty gift of fire. With this fire they scorched the forests and plains of Terra, consuming her plentiful and beautiful creations, and ravaging her land to construct their strongholds and fortresses, some of which endure to this day, thousands of years later. Terra was appalled by Kronos' actions and creations. Enraged at the devastation wrought by Kronos' offspring, she employed her mists and enchantments to fashion her own forces. Within the depths of the eternal forest, Terra brought forth the sylphs, tall, graceful, and exquisite beings brimming with magic. These sylphs became the protectors of the land, utilizing Terra's magical gift to shape their own living war machines, forming ents and war beasts, laying siege to the dwarven strongholds, and battling against the creations of Kronos. The conflict raged on for 10,000 years, with both sides battling desperately, suffering tremendous losses of life, and neither gaining an advantage over the other. At last, weary from endless centuries of combat, Kronos and Terra withdrew to unknown regions, leaving their creations to freely wander the land they had fashioned. The Sylph forces and the Dwarf forces made peace, eventually forming the original 12 kingdoms. The remainder of that tale is a subject for your history lessons. When Professor Thorne concluded, Lyra glanced up with a puzzled expression. She lifted her hand and posed a question to the elderly professor. Professor, if that's where you say the races of magic originated, where did the non-magical peoples come from? What about humans and orcs? The professor lifted his heavy round spectacles to get a clearer view of who posed the question. He grinned, pleased that at least one student showed some indication of attention in his lecture. Well, now that's quite a good question. A very good one indeed. The orcs were actually created by the sylphs, let's see, what was his name again? Ah, yes. The orcs were created by Caelum Stormweaver, the most powerful mage to ever exist. We elves needed some kind of warriors to combat the dwarven forces, so Illithor, with the assistance of Terra herself, fashioned the orcs from the very leaves of the forest. And that, my dear, is the reason for their green color. Grinning inwardly, his rosy cheeks partially obscured by his thick beard, the professor exhaled softly. One more student content. Professor, what about the humans? Ah, that's right. You inquired about them as well? Well, as the legend goes, they voyaged here on massive vessels, guided by some ancient monarch, whose name escapes me. In any case, Terra took compassion on them and bestowed upon them the western islands to inhabit, and Kronos, not wishing to be outdone, imparted to them the mysteries of iron and metalworking. Regarding their creator, I believe it was the Drowned One. We'll discuss him and the demons he brought forth later. And indeed, the humans are demons, but just as Terra granted them land, we must endeavor to civilize them, those poor, soulless beings. Lord Protector Aldrich exhaled sharply as he was flung against one of the wooden support beams of the warehouse. His entire body ached, his robes were torn in countless places, and portions of his long, flowing dark hair were singed. He rolled and regained his footing, shouting a battle cry and unleashing a stream of fire at the Lich. Spinning his sword, he jumped into the air, bringing it down upon his foe. After hours of combat, the early dawn sun had begun to rise. Surrounding him were the bodies of the guard, with only a few still standing. Throughout the warehouse lay the broken remains of the shambling dead, unholy creatures brought forth by this elven lich. Aldrich's enchanted blade sliced through the lich, the first rays of sunlight weakening him just enough. As the lich collapsed, pinned to the ground by the Lord Protector's sword, the remnants of his undead army fell as well, no longer controlled by the monster's magic. Aldrich was about to issue the order to clean up when the lich uttered its final words. We shall rise once more, regardless of how often you strike us down. The great destroyer will emerge. Lord Protector Aldrich drove his steel-shod boot into the lich's face, crushing it against the floor. He felt uneasy. This had been a fierce battle, and a lich had been present within the city. Yet, if the lich's words held truth, they faced a lengthy journey ahead. Brock would prefer to be anywhere else on the continent than his current location. Sitting there, with that irritating, overweight lizard gazing at him, and the pair of overly enthusiastic elf girls attempting to converse with him. He was doing his best to respond as briefly as possible, but nothing ever appeared to be enough for those two. Lyra and Celeste were seated on her dorm room bed, with the book about the Westerling's language between them. They had attempted to ask her human, Brock, about his homeland, what his full name was, and other such questions. At times he simply declined to answer, while on other occasions He responded with single-word replies. Progress was gradual. Lyra let out a sigh. Lyra, who knows? Perhaps the professors have a point. I mean, even though he's incredibly muscular. Here Celeste cast a glance at Brock's large biceps, which he appeared to be flexing in frustration. He doesn't really seem that, intelligent. I mean, you must have asked him like 30 questions by now. All he says is one word. He doesn't even know magic. How can you be certain that he even comprehends what's happening? Maybe he is nothing more than, well, you know. Lyra buried her face in her hands, exasperated with her slave. She had truly believed she'd formed a bond with him after he revealed his name, but no matter what she said, it seemed unable to reach him. You know, Celeste, you might be right. I'm not sure anymore. Perhaps he's just a dumb beast after all. I really don't know what to think anymore. She sighed again. Hey, try not to worry about it too much. We can always give it another shot later if you're really keen. Anyway, I think I've got something that might cheer you up. The Sylphs on the male side are hosting a party tomorrow, and all first years are welcome if you'd like to join. Come on, it'll be a good time. And it's something different to do instead of just hanging around all day with your nose in your books. You could do with getting out more. Lyra looked up, somewhat more perky. A party? I suppose it would be pretty fun. Brock crossed his arms. If there was one thing he despised more than elven music, it would be elven gatherings. Everyone present was donning a toga or some odd attire. There was magic and sylphs flitting about everywhere, and to make matters worse, they were all conversing in that overly rapid language of theirs. Garrett wasn't even around to chat with. It was just some random creatures he was tethered next to out front. With his chin propped on his fist, he began to trace circles in the dirt with a twig he'd come across. If boredom had a name, it would surely be Brock. He caught wind of some intoxicated shouts and rolled his eyes. It was a bunch of male sylphs donning their ridiculous togas, their absurd hair standing up on its own, strolling on the very air itself. As if the ground wasn't sufficient for them, Brock mused. What appeared to be their leader approached Brock, shouting something at him. Brock paid no attention. There were a few more taunts, but Brock disregarded those as well, continuing to draw his circles in the dirt. That was until he heard a splashing noise and noticed a stream coming from the elf in front of him. He got to his feet, repulsed, his circles now ruined. He heard more laughter coming from the group of sylphs and decided he'd had enough. Quickly glancing around, Brock confirmed that there were no other sylphs nearby besides himself and these jerks. He grinned, rolling his broad shoulders and cracking his knuckles. The lead elf began to look somewhat uneasy and cast a spell from his free hand at Brock. That strange sensation in the back of his head returned, and the spell vanished before it made it halfway through the air. The group of sylphs started to look even more concerned at this point, which made Brock chuckle. Perhaps it wouldn't be such a dull night after all. Lyra and Celeste stumbled their way out of the party, hearing the shouts of the guard coming from the rear. It would not be good if the daughter of the Lord Protector was caught at a party, so they hastily made their exit. When the two girls reached where Brock had been, they found him with a huge grin on his face, hands clasped behind his back. A bit too intoxicated to really ponder this, Lyra unfastened his collar, and the trio made their way back to the dorms. In the shrubbery near the party house were a group of sylphs that would be suffering from more than just a hangover come morning. They were alive, but judging by their broken teeth and black eyes, they would likely be in the infirmary for a few days. Celeste and Lyra fell onto the bed, worn out from the lengthy evening. Brock hummed quietly as he began to clean his hands, washing away some of the blood and dirt on them. It had been a successful night. Brock perched on the ledge, gazing into the breaking day. A gentle breeze from the adjacent river drifts through the air, filling his nose with the sense of a city gradually rousing itself. At this distance from the city centre, there is barely a sound of the small shops and stalls beginning to open. The sky is overcast and grey, with the faint winter sun unable to pierce through the heavy cloud cover. The aroma of salt water and fish reaches his nostrils, reminding Brock of his ruined home and his fallen father. A soft cry pierces the silence, and the circling raven alights beside the seated human. In its beak, it carries a small iron circle, with 10 points jutting outwards. Fastened to this circle is an old leather strap, worn and battered. The iron circle appears ancient, with pits and marks covering its simple surface. The raven gazes up at Brock inquisitively, as Brock stares straight ahead. It gently prods his arm and leaves the amulet with him, taking flight from the ledge and into the brightening sky. Brock clutches the amulet in one hand, the other still gripping his tattered blanket across his scarred body. A sigh escapes his lips as his thoughts linger on the lost. Brock heard a scream, gradually awakening from his alcohol-induced haze. At the second scream he turns and rushes, moving towards the source of the noise. After a few twists around the several longhouses that dotted the landscape, he came upon what was causing the screams. Before him lay several already lifeless bodies, their corpses covered with burns, some of their clothing still aflame. Atop a horse, looking down on him, was an elf. Wearing a brilliant crimson cape, complemented by a steel helm, its red horsetail flowing from the top, was the leader of the slaver party. He spotted Brock and laughed, this mere boy standing in front of him, nothing in his hands except an empty tankard. Pointing his spear at Brock, he began sharing a laugh with the other slavers by him. Brock could hear an increasing number of screams coming from the village now, as the Red Riders moved through the small hamlet, killing and gathering up the residents. Brock saw his father lying in the mud before him, his father who had brought him up, his father who had instructed him, his father at whom he had yelled the night before, his father who was told by his only son that he was despised. Brock let out a slow breath, scarcely registering the jeers of the riders surrounding him. His fingers clenched around the tankard he held. With an abrupt cry of anguish and rage, it hurtled from his grasp, directly into the face of one of the slavers. The heavy iron tankard was neither light nor yielding. It crashed into the slaver's head with a dull thud, wrenching his neck backward and causing him to topple from his horse, lifeless. The laughter and jeering ceased after that. However, the thrashing and swearing commenced. Just before Brock lost consciousness from the countless spear shaft blows to his face, he believed he caught sight of an odd bird soaring overhead. Lyra stirred from her slumber, letting out a yawn. As she looked around her room, she realized Brock wasn't in his typical place on the floor. After checking, she found he wasn't in the water closet, or just outside the door either. Turning back to her room, she felt a bit concerned. The thought crossed her mind that he might have tried to escape. She peered out the window at the dawn, only to spot Brock sitting cross-legged on the balcony, gazing off into the distance. His blonde hair was damp from the dew, but he wasn't shivering. Lyra grasped the edge of the window, examining the thick form more closely. With surprise, she noticed his shoulders shaking. Grabbing a spare blanket, she opened the door and stepped outside, carefully settling herself next to her slave. A second glance revealed that Brock was weeping. His eyes were red, his back hunched over, his face bore tear tracks, and his short beard was wet with something other than dew. Lyra placed the spare blanket over Brock, no longer feeling chilly herself. She remained seated beside him, and gradually, with great hesitation, extended her long, slender, elfin arm around the massive, drooping shoulders of her slave. He looked up, a slight bit of shock in his large blue eyes. "I'm sorry," she murmured, at last beginning to grasp why he refused to speak with her. Lord Protector Aldrich observed, as the final fallen guard was laid to rest within the great tree, his expression somber. It was the bare minimum he could offer these families of softly weeping mothers, brothers, and fathers. He made a point to personally shake the hands of the fathers, offering solace in their grief. As he reached the last one, the diligent elf clasped his hand slightly more firmly than the others. "We're grateful you took care of the scoundrel who was behind this. We're in your debt for what you've done." The Lord Protector offered a sad smile and expressed appreciation for the elf's gratitude. Yet in his heart, he was certain. He was aware that the Lich would not be the sole member of that group, and that there would undoubtedly be numerous more casualties before he uncovered the truth behind this situation, whatever it might be. The Lord Protector despised this fact. The loss of any long-lived elf was akin to erasing a piece of history. Aldrich simply wished that the cult wouldn't be overly focused on conjuring whatever it was they intended to conjure. Yet given that it was indeed a cult, he realized it was probably too much to expect. He entered his carriage and retrieved the now wrinkled and well-worn map. The carriage driver snapped his whip, and the 10 men at the front started to pull. It wasn't inexpensive to have a carriage drawn by humans, but it was a sign of prestige, one that the Lord Protector could easily afford. Brock leaned against the wall behind him, holding the 10-pointed circle in his hands. Turning it over repeatedly, he pondered why the Steel Emperor had given it to him and what it represented. Clutching it firmly in his hand, he focused on it, feeling the cool metal begin to warm in his palm. A faint, odd tingling sensation arose on the back of his neck, and he noticed several of the elves passing by him stumble slightly, then rise and glance around uneasily. Easing his mental and physical grip on the medallion, Brock observed the sylph stand up and resume walking, though a bit more slowly and cautiously than before. "Thank you, Steel Emperor, thank you for this gift." Brock grinned and reclined, pleased with the abilities that he was swiftly mastering. His thoughts drifted back to the morning, and he attempted to comprehend what that elf girl, Lyra, had meant. She was sorry. Sorry for what exactly? Sorry for his enslavement. A mere apology couldn't compensate for the humans who had perished at the merciless elven hands, yet she did appear to be sincerely distressed. Moreover, feeling Lyra's arm draped over his shoulders made him feel pleasant. He sighed, muttering to himself, "Why couldn't life be more straightforward like war?" he pondered. It would have been preferable to have a simple black-and-white world. It would have been nice to know more about Lyra. It would have been nice to not be enslaved. However, regrettably, things weren't always that straightforward. Lyra sat in her lecture hall, scarcely paying attention as the rambling old professor droned on about the higher theorems of magic, and scribbled formulas on the board consisting of more letters and numbers than actual magical symbols. She adjusted the charcoal pencils on her desk into even straighter lines. She rearranged the paper and parchment on her desk to form perfect rectangles, with no stray edges sticking out. With everything in perfect order, she started to become bored and distracted once again. Lyra scanned the classroom, her gaze falling on each student in turn. There was Finn, sweet, hapless Finn, who seemed perpetually confused. There was Jasper, his parchment folded up to block the professor's view, engrossed in staging miniature clay golem death matches on his desk. Mildly intrigued, Lyra observed for a moment. Soon tiring of watching the tiny golems repeatedly demolish each other, her attention shifted to Serena. Oh, by Terra's great groves, how she despised Serena. Coming from one of the city's wealthiest families, their precious darling had to possess everything. Lyra suspected that Serena had only acquired that old human as her protector because she'd seen Brock and wanted to outdo Lyra. While Lyra would barely scrape by in classes, passing through sheer magical ability, Serena would know every answer before each test. Lyra privately wondered if Serena's family simply bribed the professors outright. After all, they were always the most generous donors to the Citadel. Turning her eyes from Serena, Lyra's attention shifted to Celeste. Now what could be going through her mind? Celeste found herself contemplating Brock. She was experiencing some deeply conflicting emotions at present, and had little desire to discuss them, much less dwell on them. Throughout her life, she had been described as pretty by some, and even beautiful by others. This, coupled with her natural blonde hair, had led many to assume that Celeste was largely a simple, air-headed girl. However, this wasn't entirely accurate. Celeste was intelligent, though not particularly in matters of magic. She possessed an aptitude for art, proportions, and spatial awareness. Her notebook was adorned with numerous sketches of her friends, family, and classmates. Recently, it had come to contain several drawings of Brock, depicted in various poses, him flexing, him carrying objects, him holding her. She let out a sigh. While she couldn't deny having feelings for Brock, it still didn't feel right. After all, he was human, hardly more than an animal. Now Celeste was into some unusual things, but that seemed a bit too extreme even for her. Lyra could and would go on about how humans were equal to sylphs and dwarves, but Celeste wasn't really convinced. Humans had never used magic, and it didn't appear they would anytime soon. So in her view, and in the minds of most sylphs, humans were only slightly above horses and goats. This only brought her back to her initial dilemma. She liked Brock. He was strong, muscular, and didn't talk much, the complete opposite of Celeste. Yet he was human. Celeste resumed drawing, trying to think of anything but Brock and failing miserably. The rain arrived seemingly out of nowhere, and it quickly developed into a fairly wet day. A few of the market stalls closed up early, while others simply produced more umbrellas or minor spells to keep the rain at bay. Aldrich clutched the cowl of his cloak firmly against his face as he pressed on. He had forgone his customary dress reds, opting instead for a plain brown cloak. His destination lay in one of the city's less respectable areas, and it would be unwise politically to arrive there in full regalia. Moreover, the elf he intended to visit was known to have little fondness for government representatives. As Aldrich turned a corner into a back alley, he nearly collided with a tall elf, who appeared to be cradling a hovering sphere of ice. The imposing elf was clad entirely in black, with multiple blades fastened to his leather-clad form. "What brings you to this area? It might be wiser for you to simply turn back and return to where you started." Aldrich rolled his eyes and, after a swift look over his shoulder, simply pushed the other elf to the ground, the cobblestone itself rising up and twisting around the hapless elf. "Oh, just shut it, will you?" He rapped 3 times on the shuttered door, hesitated, knocked twice, paused once more, and tapped a final 4 times. The shutter opened, glimpsed Aldrich's furious expression, and slammed closed. Seconds later, the door swung open. "You know, you don't have to disable every single one of my gate guards. I'm running short on elves willing to take the position. Maybe I'll just compel some men to do it instead. Anyway, my dear Aldrich, it's so delightful to see you. What brings you here for this pleasant visit?" Aldrich shook his head, shutting the door to the cramped and dimly lit room behind him. "I wouldn't assign a human to remain in one spot for longer than 3 seconds without an obedience spell. Those creatures are so unreliable." He took a seat at the little wooden table, gazing at the grimy elf across from him. "Regarding the reason for my visit, I'm certain your people are already aware of the incident at that warehouse a few nights back. Now I need to understand if there are any additional links to the individuals involved. Is this cult extensive? Are there more lichs in their ranks? What entity are they attempting to call forth?" The slender, grimy elf nodded, contemplating. From a pouch at his hip, he extracted 3 tightly rolled scrolls, each bearing different seals. He slid them halfway across the table in Aldrich's direction. Aldrich extended his hand to take them, only to have the scrolls yanked just out of his grasp. "Come now, Reggie, you're well aware that nothing comes for free, so tell me, what have you got for me this time?" Aldrich dipped his hand into his pocket and pushed across the table 3 hefty keys. The grimy elf lifted one of its peculiar eyebrows, not quite grasping the keys yet. "These keys belong to 3 separate slave collars. Should you arrive at the 7th gate at midnight tonight, 3 human slave girls will happen to fall from the wagon transporting them into the city. As I'm aware of your more—" Here Aldrich hesitated, unsure how to word his statement. "Unusual preferences. I believed it would be better if the slaves weren't listed on the official census. No guard wants to deal with reports of damaged property." The dirty elf laughed, leaning back on its chair. "Oh ho ho, what a salesperson we have here. Go on, take the scrolls. I'm certain you'll find the majority of what you're seeking in those. Now, I know I've inquired about this previously, but are you absolutely sure you couldn't arrange for a nice, young, plump elf maiden to wander into my vicinity?" The completely repulsed and anger-filled expression on Aldrich's face answered that question. Without even bothering to speak to the other elf, Aldrich rose abruptly and departed, pausing only to issue a warning. You ought to understand that I merely tolerate you at best. Should I learn of any further abductions of real sylphs rather than human captives, there will be consequences." Aldrich shut the door forcefully, relieved to have left that place. Releasing the rocky restraints on the guard outside, he rushed back to his tower, keen to examine his newly acquired scrolls. The lofty tower of wood and stone stretched upward into the sky, nearly matching the governor's palace in the distance. Nearly. It wouldn't be wise to provoke the governor of the Imperium's wealthiest province, so Lord Protector Aldrich resided in his nearly imposing tower, a faint flame flickering from an unusual magical sphere hovering beside him. On his desk before him rested an unrolled scroll, slightly torn and discolored. Upon the aged surface of the scroll was a collection of ancient runes and symbols, predating the citadel and the city itself. They encircled a mystical diagram in a circular fashion. Aldrich, who took pride in his position as archmage and head battle mage, couldn't even begin to comprehend the symbol before him. From what he could discern, it appeared to be a blend of a description of a being or figure, intricately intertwined with a summoning rune, and a particular blocky sketch he couldn't place. Aldrich exhaled softly, transcribing the diagram onto a clean piece of parchment. Having duplicates was always beneficial. Lyra sighed as she received the third parcel from her father that week. Unwrapping it, she found the familiar coin purse, coffee beans, magical elixirs, and various other items. She carried it over to the expanding stack by the entrance. Settling down beside Celeste on the bed, Lyra hesitated before posing her question. "Celeste, are you ever weary of your father sending you presents? I mean, I've been attempting to persuade my dad to stop, but he constantly talks about how he wants to take care of me and such things. It was pleasant when I was a teen, but now—" Celeste put down her sketchbook to look up, one eyebrow raised. "Who's that in there, and what have you done with Lyra? Come on, you're basically complaining about free things. There are worse issues in life. Plus, you're fortunate your dad even allows you to shop. Mine always would purchase stuff for me, something about the market." Celeste lifted her hands to make air quotes. "Being too risky for a girl like me. I mean, seriously, who even says that kind of thing nowadays? I mean, the markets used to be quite bad, actually. My father would constantly return home with terrible stories about them. No joke, did you hear about how one of the humans stabbed another right near the fruit store? Just there, with some kind of improvised knife or something." "Yeah, but, well, still. Shouldn't it be my decision, though, and we've got these protectors, don't we? Shouldn't there be a purpose for them? Shouldn't they be capable of, protecting?" "I suppose, but you know how my dad is. He's always so concerned about me. I bet your dad is just the same." Lyra leaned into her cushions, thinking about her father. I'm beginning to be concerned about him. He's not been himself since Mum was murdered. I believe it's why he has such a strong dislike for humans." "That's likely why he's so concerned about you. After learning about what occurred with your mum, I'm amazed he didn't immediately head to the front lines." "Yeah, he's been rather quiet about it, all things considered. I wonder what's up with that." "He has not been quiet, haven't you heard, the new imperial decree?" "Wait, what, has my dad passed something without telling me?" "Well, you're bound to hear about it before long. We're heading into a war with the Eastlanders." Back in the present, Lyra glanced over at Brock, who was walking alongside her. Was he aware of the true reason behind their nation's conflict? She supposed not. From the small bits of information she had managed to extract from him, Lyra understood that Brock had scarcely experienced the world beyond his village. She recalled not having spoken to her father for weeks following the declaration of war. She had been so furious about it, attempting to persuade him to abandon his personal vendetta against the humans. Lyra realized now that that was a futile effort, but it didn't mean she agreed with her father. Far from it. Nevertheless, she still loved him, which was why they were currently en route to his tower. Lyra was concerned about her father. He was constantly occupied with defending the city and fighting against the Eastlanders, and she questioned whether he even found time to rest. She hoped that the small pouch of tea and the ceramic mug she had crafted in art class would be sufficient to help him relax a bit. With her mother absent, her father appeared to never stop, always in motion and working. She wished he was doing okay. Lord Protector Aldrich was far from all right. He had just decoded one of the scrolls, which seemed to be an informal list of cult members. Normally, this would be welcome news, as it would be straightforward to now eradicate the cult. However, several of the names recorded on the scroll were key figures in elven politics, some even beyond the city. Thus he would need to proceed with extreme caution, if only to ensure that he himself was not wrongly accused or quietly eliminated during the night. The first name on his list was Zephyr Leafshaper, a prominent merchant. Since the guardsmen were likely in his pocket, it would be challenging to simply attempt to apprehend him based on this information. Hence, a more discreet approach was necessary. Tucking some costly poisons into the folds of his dark brown robe, the Lord Protector exited his room, leaving behind his bright red cloak. At times, being recognized was not what one desired. Brock reached the top of the staircase alongside Lyra, his strong neck pulling against the demeaning iron collar encircling it. He vowed that the moment he was free, the very first thing he would do is melt down that accursed collar into nothing but a puddle of slag. Brock wasn't too exhausted from the climb, and had to acknowledge it did him some good to exercise more regularly. However, Lyra was not doing quite as well. Red-faced and perspiring lightly, the tall elf leaned against the wall, catching her breath. Once she had taken a brief rest, she walked over to the door of her father's room and knocked, and waited some more, and waited just a little bit longer. At last, appearing unable to wait any longer, she pulled open the door. Brock didn't mind this, as he had been growing rather bored with the delay, and had been discreetly attempting to etch his initials into the stone wall. The door groaned open, revealing an empty room with papers strewn about, and no sign of the Lord Protector. Lyra slid down the wall, feeling defeated. She held that unsightly cup she had crafted in her hands, placing it carefully on the floor beside her. With nothing else to do, Brock took a seat next to her. Lyra faced Brock, attempting to communicate in his language, and largely managing to do so. Brock, did your father ever act this way? Making you do what he wants, never being there for you, constantly failing to show up? I can't understand why I keep forgiving him. He's such a jerk. Unexpectedly, following an extended pause, Brock replied, in his low, gravelly tone. At times, my dad was a decent person. I don't hold it against him for not always desiring to be in my presence. Lyra gazed at Brock. It was the lengthiest response she had ever received from him. Eager to learn more, but wary of frightening him back into his usual reticence, she carefully probed for additional details. What was your father like? Brock closed his eyes, leaning his head back onto the stone. He was a good man, a strong man, an honorable man. He was there to shield me from myself. That is what he excelled at. Protecting people. I don't merit being called his son. Lyra could not believe her ears. What are you saying? You've kept me safe, haven't you? You essentially rescued me and my friends too. Lyra instantly felt remorse for her words, as a solitary big tear trickled down Brock's face. I wasn't able to save them all. Inform my village that I served as a guardian. Let the fallen in the fields know that I shielded them. Tell the enslaved in the mines that I defended them. No, I'm aware of my true nature. I am a wicked man. With that, Brock fell silent and would talk no more. They lingered for several more minutes at the Lord Protector's chamber, and when he failed to appear, eventually made their way back to the academy. Lyra attended a class she was scheduled for, while Brock remained outside, his expression stoic. He sensed a small pebble strike his arm and turned to find Garrett coming towards him. Geez, dude, you look like you've just spotted a ghost. What's the matter with you? Brock's stare quieted Garrett, and they remained there for a moment, wordless. Following a brief uncomfortable pause, Brock broke the silence. We can't afford to waste any more time. Round up whatever slaves you're able to, and I'll rendezvous with them, at any place and time you can arrange. I'm relying on you, Garrett. With luck, we can start formulating our strategy instead of just idling about out here. Before long, we'll embark on our journey to exact vengeance upon this accursed citadel and these wretched elves. Garrett gave a nod, opting not to interrogate the big fellow beside him. It wouldn't be beneficial, and after all, what harm could there be in simply having a meeting? Lord Protector Aldrich glided quietly into the throng, a wicked grin on his face. His pockets now emptied of his assorted toxins, he nearly pranced back to his tower. The masses paid no heed, the crowd remained oblivious, but he was certain that some unfortunate slave and the cultist merchant would be experiencing a rather unpleasant time, right about now. A shriek burst from the dwelling 3 blocks down. The throng turned and gazed, and Aldrich pivoted with the throng. Nothing appeared more suspicious than a cloaked figure fleeing in the opposite direction of screaming. So, he permitted the mass of people to sweep him along, carefully behaving and responding, to be perceived as nothing more than an ordinary individual heading to the marketplace. He grinned once more as he noticed a few armed members of the watch dashing towards the mansion. It would be somewhat costly to bribe the guards who would figure it out, but he could simply chalk it up as essential expenses from his government stipend. Aldrich adored his occupation. Brock gazed into the darkness, clutching an iron amulet in his hand. He wore his ragged clothes and collar, with an old musty blanket fluttering in the breeze. Gradually lifting the 10-pointed circle towards the night sky, he murmured pleas to a long-forgotten deity. "Steel Emperor, if you can hear me at this moment, bestow upon me the strength to persevere. Grant me the power to prevail. Give me the might to attain my vengeance." In the distant barrows and ruins something awakened. From the scattered stones and crumbling walls, the ancient apparition emerged, still ghostly. The intangible form floated up and away from its home shrine, moving towards the voice that summoned it. In front of Brock, a tall figure gradually materialized from the evening mists. Still adorned from head to toe in metal and chains, the forgotten god appeared to be marginally taller, somewhat more erect than previously. Brock sensed a distinct impression of a paternal smile, though all he could perceive was an expressionless faceplate. "Yes, my chosen one, you called me." Brock gazed at the being in front of him. He realized this was his chance to escape servitude, yet he still felt slightly uneasy. "I desire to be stronger, in both mind and body. I long to vanquish my fears and foes alike. Bestow upon me power." The Steel Emperor inclined his head, seeming to contemplate this proposal. Following a brief period of consideration, he responded, "No, do you understand why I selected you, Ragnarsson, instead of any other human slave in this pathetic elven excuse for a city? Do you?" Brock shook his head, unsure of how to reply. "It wasn't because you lacked fear. It wasn't because you were the mightiest, though you do appear to come in a close second. It was because you exemplified the finest aspects of humanity. It was because you possessed hope alongside your anger. It was because you had intellect in addition to your power." The Steel Emperor strode back and forth before his solitary spectator, his armored limbs clasped behind his back. "The reason was that you brought to mind a young man, a young king, who had to guide his people against creatures they had never even imagined before. It was because you reminded me of myself." At this, the Steel Emperor took off his crowned helmet. Underneath there was a pale face with an unkempt beard and long light blonde hair. The visage was an odd blend of youth and age, of mortal and divine. "When I offered myself to protect that young kingdom from those sylphs, individuals like you granted me strength. People like you had faith in me, and that is the reason I stand here today. My realm is crumbling, and the sylphs might succeed in demolishing it. If they do, I shall perish. I do not fear death. I anticipated mine long ago, but I am concerned for my kingdom. I worry about humanity. That is why you are my chosen champion, Brock Ragnarsson. That is why you have become a mage breaker. For now, farewell. I anticipate our next encounter." The Steel Emperor donned his helm and gradually vanished, leaving Brock once more gazing into the night. This time it didn't feel quite as cold. Brock stood in front of the gathered slaves, his long, unkempt blonde hair swaying in the breeze. Though he wore nothing but simple rags like any other slave, he seemed to exude a more noble presence. It might have been because he stood upright, his back unbowed, his pride intact. It could have been because he was the biggest slave there, both in height and in build. Or it might have been because Brock was unaware of any of these things and saw himself as an equal. Any one of these various factors could have contributed to the subtle reverence with which he was viewed by the grimy and famished slaves. It was night-time outside, a few weeks after Brock's conversation with the Steel Emperor. This evening, he had shared the tale of the no-longer-forgotten deity, with each of the slaves listening intently to the peculiar man before them. As if to demonstrate the veracity of the story, and to offer something a bit more concrete than words, Brock raised his 10-pointed amulet for all to observe. The nearly 60 slaves crammed into the small room would have gasped if they had possessed the strength. Brock and Garrett had been moving from one slave barrack to another, sharing the tale of the Steel Emperor, and trying to instill a glimmer of hope in the downtrodden and broken slaves. Well, Brock had been doing that. Garrett had kept an eye on the more suspicious slaves, ones that might potentially leak this information to their masters. If he noticed any leaving without cause, or sneaking away when the speech was over, Brock would have a private conversation with this slave. If the slave still failed to see the error of his ways, Brock and Garrett would ensure it was a long while before the slave could inform anyone again. The speeches Brock had been delivering appeared to be making an impact. Slave labor in the Citadel decreased slightly, as the humans became somewhat less willing to fully comply with their masters' demands. Nevertheless, despite all the energy Brock and Garrett had been investing in their campaign, it would take an exceptionally long time before the slaves could be motivated to revolt, not to mention equipped or even prepared. This didn't discourage Brock, who devoted himself to these endeavors with enthusiasm. That evening, as Brock and Garrett started to slip back to their rooms, Garrett posed the question that had been troubling him since the start of their campaign. "Brock, you do understand that even if we somehow pull off this reckless plan of yours, we'll need to have a new Jarl, or if not that, at least a basic war leader. Are you certain you're prepared for that kind of responsibility?" Brock appeared taken aback by the inquiry, halting abruptly and pivoting a bit. "Me? Take on the role of the new Jarl? For what reason would I assume such a position? Surely one of his nieces or nephews, or perhaps a cousin, must have survived the attack. I'm merely the son of a housecarl, not some member of the nobility." "Brock, you must understand that most of the slaves here aren't from our region. By the gods, some of them have even lived their entire lives here, having been born into slavery. Nobody is going to care about who was the Jarl of our village and which person was related to him. They already view you as their leader. Making you Jarl is simply the next logical step." "However, Garrett, I'm not a leader. Certainly I can teach them how to fight and motivate them to do so, but I'm just an ordinary man. I'm a foot soldier. You recall me during my raids. I excel at combat, but that doesn't mean I excel at leadership." "Oh, and who would be more suited to lead our group? The kitchen slave who spent his entire life washing dishes? Let's be realistic, Brock. You and I are among the few with genuine experience in combat. They already see you as their odd kind of spiritual guide, after all that talk you've been spreading about the Steel Emperor. Appointing you as their war chief isn't exactly a far-fetched idea." Brock remained silent as he and Garrett went their separate ways. Easing the wooden door open, Brock slipped into Lyra's room, settling down on his mat. He was relieved that Lyra continued to believe in her father's supposed magical enchantment. It made it much simpler to sneak out or choose when to ignore her. Garrett had provided him with plenty to ponder during the return journey. Brock wasn't certain if he was prepared to embrace his new position as a leader, but since it would bring justice for his deceased father and village, he permitted it to unfold. The enchanted flame hovering beside Lord Protector Aldrich flickered and nearly extinguished. As Aldrich roused himself from his drowsiness, the flame surged back to life, casting light across the chamber once more. He stared intently at the documents before him, silently urging them to disclose their hidden information. While he had succeeded in deciphering the peculiar language the cultists employed for their roster of members, he remained just as baffled by the odd diagram contained in the second scroll. He recognized a few of the symbols and inscriptions, but more than half of it was complete nonsense to him. This marked the 7th consecutive sleepless night that Aldrich had devoted to studying this scroll. During the day, he had started to track down the other names inscribed on the list, and was preparing to strike against a particular slaver in the near future. It was unfortunate for such a respected businessman in a trade that Aldrich admired, but a cultist remained a cultist. Celeste started her day with a sketch, as was her custom. This time, though, it was a bit different. For one thing, she was in art class alongside her friend Lyra, instead of in her bedroom with her drowsy pet. Secondly, they were sketching from a live model today, rather than using a basic object or something comparable. Lastly, they were tasked with drawing their pet or protector. Celeste gazed at her drawing of Scales the lizard, perched on his cushion. It was well executed, as Celeste had a talent for art, in contrast to her friend. Nevertheless, it remained a portrait of Scales the lizard. There were limited poses a plump, fire-breathing lizard could assume. She looked over at Lyra, or more precisely, Brock. He was standing there, appearing bored, with his hands behind his head. His worn shirt was slightly torn, and Celeste could see his large, well-defined arms reaching up, his muscular biceps curving. Brock's melancholy yet beautiful blue eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, staring off into the distance. Celeste glanced back at Scales. The comparison was not in his favor. She let out a sigh. Why did everything have to be so complex, she pondered. Why wasn't she drawn to some youthful elf mage, slender yet alluring? A swift second look at Brock's rippling muscles revealed the answer. Celeste resumed her drawing, musing if it was because Brock was the first human she had encountered who appeared to possess a measure of intelligence. Every elf had encountered a human before, but most of them simply disregarded their slaves. You didn't give much consideration to who cultivated your food, who labored in your mines, and who transported your goods. You just continued with your life, pushing aside all such unpleasant thoughts. However, when you begin to hear from your closest friend that these slaves might actually possess minds of their own, that these slaves could be more than merely cheap labor, things become more complex. Celeste started to add the final details to her sketch, filling in one of Scales's plump folds, instead of the shadow thrown by Brock's striking silhouette. She longed for life to be less complicated. Aldrich looked up in annoyance at the entrance of one of his guards. "What is it? I told you I'm not to be disturbed." The guard swallowed his fear, gazing directly forward. He started to perspire anxiously in his ceremonial armor. With any luck, he would not be burned to ashes for this. "Sir, a foreign delegate is waiting outside, sir. He's asking for permission to have a word with you, sir." Following a brief hesitation, the guard resumed speaking, though with a somewhat quieter voice. "Sir, the delegate has declined to depart until he meets with you. It appears to concern a matter of significance." Aldrich rolled his eyes at the guard, returning his attention to his papers. He gestured with one hand to the guard, dismissing him from the room. "Go on, bring him in. I suppose I can speak to whoever it is." The guard departed, appearing relieved, shutting the door as he left. A short while later, the door opened once more, and the tower's floor trembled slightly. Irritated at the one who would interrupt his sensitive work, the Lord Protector glanced up. Gazing back at him was a stocky dwarf, appearing to be all muscle. His lengthy black beard was plaited into 3 points, and his hair was pulled back in a ponytail. He glanced up at the Archmage and grinned. "Well, I've been told that you're seeking to eliminate some cultists. Nasty affair, that. In any case, I'd like to propose my services as a seasoned expert in dealing with cults." Aldrich nearly choked on his tea at the utter boldness of the dwarf. Coughing slightly, he inquired, "And just who exactly do you think you are, and what makes you believe that you can help?" The dwarf's grin widened further, his heavy accent evident in the high elven he was trying to use. "I am Thorsten, ruler of Cragpeak. You might recognize me by my more familiar title, Paladin Thorsten from the Battle of Zartanos, at your disposal." With that, the diminutive dwarf removed his oversized hat, bowing in front of the perplexed Aldrich. Lyra headed to her next class, her drawing of Brock safely stored in her notebook. It wasn't a great sketch or even a passable one, and she was all too keenly aware of this fact. Nevertheless, it was her creation, and that was all that really mattered to her. She entered her history class, leaving Brock outside with the other animals. A slight pang of guilt struck her as she did so, pondering how he might feel about it. Lyra had been attempting to persuade some others that the rights of their human slaves ought to be given a bit of consideration, but her efforts had largely fallen on deaf ears. Settling into her chair, she arranged her notebook, casting a glance toward the slightly flustered Celeste. Glimpsing down at her open history notebook, Lyra noticed some sketches of a particular individual they both knew well. She smiled to herself curiously, contemplating how to feel. She figured that Celeste, having a crush on Brock, would likely make her more receptive to the idea that humans were people too, but it was still a bit strange. Lyra shrugged. It wasn't her place to judge, so she didn't. Taking out her charcoal stylus, Lyra waited for the lecture to begin. Now you ought to be familiar with how the initial elven kingdoms were established from your theology class. However, my distinguished colleague likely didn't brief you on the more intricate history behind the how and why of the Imperium's origins. Now, I assume that you've all brought your textbooks and notes, as you will be evaluated on this material later in the month. Now then, let's begin. The trio of coastal elven kingdoms experienced peace in their initial years, rarely encountering any disputes with neighboring realms. Nevertheless, following a number of border incidents, the professor's words faded into the background as Lyra started to examine the window facing outside. She noticed Brock and that other person, Serena's guardian, conversing with quite lively gestures. She pondered what they might be debating about. Brock shook his head at Garrett, spreading his arms. I honestly don't know what you mean. Seriously. I'm not pretending to be clueless. I simply can't grasp what you're attempting to convey. Oh, come on now, you're aware that elf girl has a thing for you. Nearly all she does is gaze at you. I barely even see her just when they head to class. But this old fellow knows a thing or two, and I can tell when a girl's fallen in love. But she's an elf. They enslaved our people. They force us to wear these ridiculous collars. Why in the name of the gods' green earth would she have any interest in me? I'm not sure what you've been observing, but it's pretty obvious that most of the elves around here are weaklings. I mean, I'm an old guy and I'm not particularly strong, but have you looked at the soldiers? I'm nearly twice their size. Garrett began counting off his fingers. You're young, that's always a positive for girls. You're big. Well, maybe not quite as tall as an elf, but close enough. You're forbidden. Anyone around this age tends to rebel against their parents, and what better way than getting involved with someone your parents disapprove of? Brock, I'm actually surprised you didn't notice it earlier. Brock shook his head, shrugging sheepishly at the same time. I'm just not sure, Garrett. For the past 5 months I've been harboring hatred towards elves and wanting to end them, and now you're saying one of them has feelings for me. I simply don't know what to think. Garrett nodded, leaning back against a nearby wall. I understand. Well, if you reconsider, I'm certain she'll be very accommodating. Brock appeared slightly horrified by this mention. He was comfortable on the battlefield. Combat and killing were things he excelled at. This matter was not his forte. Brock had been truthful when he had said that he hadn't noticed. He rarely noticed much of this kind of thing anyway. Lord Protector Aldrich raised his hand to his forehead, trying to massage the headache away. He was presently examining the reports from the conflict with the Eastlanders, while that foolish dwarven paladin was comparing the unidentifiable magical symbol with various tomes he had carried from Crag Peak. The war had begun so promisingly. It still was, as the Imperium forces possessed battle mages and stone golems, in contrast to chainmail-clad men wielding axes. Yet it was not the progress of the war, or even the various casualty reports, that troubled the Lord Protector. It was the unexplained vanishing of a battle fleet belonging to a certain Jarl Ragnar the Bastard. The fleet was substantial, nearly larger than the 7th Legion. How, in Terra's good name, it had seemingly vanished completely from the face of the sea was beyond Aldrich's comprehension. He opened a fresh report, mentally shrugging. Despite a nagging feeling in the back of his mind urging caution, Aldrich chose to assume that the fleet was destroyed by the infamously rough waters surrounding the Western Islands. Jotting down a brief note on a parchment to the side, Aldrich moved on, now perusing an account of the fall of the fortress of Frosthold. Frosthold was a sizable castle, located on the border between Elven and Westerling territory, and had been isolated from external supplies for weeks. How those confounded humans had managed to hold out for so long baffled Aldrich. His report readings were disrupted by a gasp from Thorsten. He glanced over to see his small partner holding 2 scrolls side by side, comparing the findings. Thorsten looked up at Aldrich, his eyes wide open. "Reggie, my boy, you might want to get a look at this." Irritated by the interruption, Aldrich rose to his feet, moving purposefully towards Thorsten. He longed for the dwarf to depart. He even started to devise a plan that wouldn't incriminate himself to simply be rid of the bothersome individual. Aldrich bent down and stared at the scrolls held up by the dwarf. Brock had been hearing the elves around him converse for nearly 7 months now, and, with the unwitting assistance of Lyra, had started to understand their language. He didn't disclose this to anyone except Garrett, aiming to keep it largely under wraps. He accompanied Lyra to her next class, hearing the elves converse. Brock still disliked the sound of elven speech, but it bothered him less now, as long as he could comprehend it. They were heading to a class on combat magic, a subject that Brock was keen to learn as much about as he could. Fortunately for him, the class was to be held outdoors, as the Citadel staff preferred not to deal with unexpected explosions in classrooms or corridors. As a result, a shooting range had been set up. The area was expansive, nearly vacant except for the lines of targets arranged at the far end. The ground consisted of firmly compacted soil, with a handful of resilient grass clumps sprouting sporadically across it. The targets came in diverse forms, some resembling human figures, others circular, and a few that Brock could only surmise were modelled after different creatures. The instructor was far from the typical doddering old elf stereotype that typically taught classes at the Citadel. He was tall, muscular for an elf, and wore long, flowing robes that were cut off at the sleeve. Brock could only assume it was to display his biceps, which, compared to Brock's, weren't actually that impressive. He seemed to try and foster a rough-and-tough image, but not everyone bought into it. Nevertheless, a good number of the elven girls in the group appeared to be quite taken with him. Brock found himself positioned near the rear of the area, close to the boundary. The instructor had the students form a line to start shooting fire from their hands at different targets. One by one, each student would step up, release a burst of flame, and then return to the main group. When Lyra's turn approached, Brock leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Using his hard-won skill to partially comprehend the elven tongue, he caught snippets of conversation from several male elves nearby. A brief look at this group confirmed they were the ones he had roughed up many nights ago during that party. They seemed to be talking about Lyra as she practiced her war magics, more specifically her backside, in colourful detail. Brock scowled, irritated. Although he was no longer magically compelled to safeguard Lyra, she had been the sole elf who had shown him even a hint of kindness, so he still felt somewhat responsible for ensuring her well-being. Brock disliked hearing Lyra discussed in such a manner, but he held his tongue for now. Following a few more elves, the initial member of that irritating group stepped up to make an attempt. Brock quietly started to employ his ability, uncertain of its strength, range of influence, and whether it was actually having any effect. As the incredibly faint blue runes under the surface of his skin started to glow with a barely noticeable light, Brock realized that it was working. Additional evidence was the elf's inability to create even the tiniest spark during his turn, yet Brock had underestimated his own power. Even as the elf was attempting and failing to cast his spell, the stern young professor's eyes grew wide. With a brief command, he concluded the class then and there, going so far as to request the students return to their dormitories. The professor rushed off into the distance, leaving the bothersome elf to be teased by his classmates, and the rest of the students to begin gossiping in curiosity about why the lesson had ended so suddenly. Brock felt a bit uneasy, yet was reasonably sure that the trail wouldn't be traced back to him. After all, who would suspect an ordinary human slave to be more than he seemed? Now Brock understood the strength of his capability. He flashed a predatory smile, prepared for the days and nights ahead. Soon they would rebel. Soon. The dwarf refused to depart. This greatly displeased Lord Protector Aldrich. Yet, as the dwarf was officially a citizen of a neighboring kingdom, there was little he could do about it. He glanced sideways at his short companion, who was presently struggling to keep pace with the long-legged elf. He had introduced himself as Paladin Thorsten of Cragpeak, which did indicate he possessed at least some military experience. However, it was not the dwarf's combat skills that had aided Aldrich. It was his ability to recognize that one persistent magical symbol. Once identified, both Aldrich and Thorsten had immediately understood what the cult had been planning. This very symbol was the reason Aldrich and the dwarf were nearly running to the next elf on that list, a proprietor of the potion stall in the market. It had been uncovered that this elf had been supplying a considerable quantity of illegal substances and other questionable magical items to the cult. Yet the troubling aspect was not that the cult was now known to possess some highly potent summoning and daemon-worshipping materials. No, the troubling aspect was what the deciphered magical symbol had disclosed. This wasn't just a basic daemon-worshipping cult. This wasn't even a relatively powerful summoning cult. This was a massive cult with a single purpose. This was a cult made to summon an elder god. Lyra was in her room attempting to read a book. She was attempting, but not quite managing. Her thoughts kept returning to that odd interruption during the warfare magics lesson. It was not just almost unheard of to halt a class like that, but the situation was peculiar as well. After the students had been dismissed, they were all instructed to return to their dorms for a head count, and Lyra was fairly certain that she had observed several of the staff and junior professors patrolling the grounds, appearing as if they were looking for something. It was all rather peculiar and unusual, and Lyra couldn't quite understand it. She placed her book down to quietly observe the strangely smiling Brock. Lyra hadn't seen him smile for nearly his entire time as her slave. The sole occasion when Brock had been noticed with a grin on his face was when he had slain those cut purses. Brock's smile might have been reassuring to other humans, but there was something different about it that made Lyra feel uneasy. There was something that seemed out of place on the face of a man or elf. There was something feral, something unrestrained, and something animalistic behind that smile. That smile made Lyra afraid. Brock rested on his mat, feeling as content as possible. He was now aware that, due to the Steel Emperor's presence, he would have the ability to stop much of the magic that would surely be directed at his small slave uprising. He would finally be able to rescue humans. He would at last be capable of saving people. Brock cast an uneasy sidelong glance at Lyra. Garrett had mentioned that the elf girl had taken a liking to him, and Brock simply presumed it was Lyra, as she was the only one who treated him with any measure of respect. Brock wasn't certain how to feel about that. He did sense some kind of connection between Lyra and himself, but he wasn't sure if that was merely because they had spent so much time in each other's company. He truly did like Lyra. For an elf, she appeared to be kind. She was intelligent, clever enough to attend this so-called citadel, more so than Brock believed himself to be. She was also quite beautiful. Of course, elven women were remarkably adept at being attractive to humans, a fact Brock had certainly observed, yet it wasn't her physical allure that Brock found appealing. Brock appreciated that she was kind. He admired that she made an effort to be a good person. He was fond of her. Brock made the choice to attempt to protect Lyra throughout the uprising. He wished to keep her from harm. Aldrich huddled behind a few crates, hearing the cracking thwack of a crossbow bolt striking the wood beside him. He swore under his breath. Why was it never simple? Why did they always insist on the difficult path? The Lord Protector felt he might never understand. As it happened, the potion seller wasn't the sole participant in the scheme to provide for the cult. A number of his costly and highly trained bodyguards had also been involved with the steadily expanding cult. These particular bodyguards were clad from head to toe in heavy steel armor, with special enchantments woven into the plating to repel the most common magical assaults. ice, wind gusts, and much to the dismay of the fire mage Lord Protector, Fire. Swiftly turning his body to emerge from his improvised shelter, Aldrich raised both hands, unleashing dual columns of fire towards his foes. He was aware that it wouldn't injure them, but it would obscure their vision long enough for him to locate another hiding spot. The marketplace had emptied rather swiftly when the hushed arrest had escalated into a full-blown conflict between Aldrich, Thorsten, and the handful of town watchmen, and the 20, now 18, bodyguards. The once bustling square had transformed into a scene of overturned and burning carts, several lifeless bodies, and the eerie yet tense silence that accompanies only a standoff. Aldrich's mind raced. Thorsten had been somewhat helpful, smashing that absurd hammer of his into the head of one of the bodyguards, crushing it completely. Aldrich realized that this battle could not, and certainly should not, continue longer than necessary, so he frantically attempted to devise a new strategy. He mapped out the area in his mind, considering his surroundings and those of his enemies. Recalling that the building they were holed up in had primarily wooden supports, Aldrich began to formulate a plan. With both hands joined, the Lord Protector unleashed a massive fireball, burning through several stalls and, crucially, the building's supports. Transforming the former structure into a blazing inferno, Aldrich sensed the heat from his position many yards away. He grimaced as the building crumbled. While the bodyguards might have had heat-resistant armor, they lacked protection against gravity and falling debris. Aldrich examined the aftermath of his actions, his gloved hands resting on his hips. It wasn't the neatest job. In fact, it was rather sloppy. The cult would surely get wind of this, along with much of the city. He needed to accelerate the timeline. Based on Thorsten's estimates, the cult would be ready to call forth their deity sometime between 3 days and a week from now. Aldrich hoped for a week. Brock stood alongside Garrett inside one of the slave barracks, clutching a bundle of sticks in his hand. As he allowed the collection to tumble onto the floor, it revealed fire-sharpened stakes and spears. While not effective against a trained guard in plate armor, it would have to suffice until the slaves could acquire some proper weapons. The slaves nearly inched forward in reverence. It was the first instance they had sensed that some authority was being given back to them. They possessed spears now, as feeble as they were, and they could have an impact. Each of them started clamoring about what they would do, which of their tormentors would be slain first, all desiring vengeance right there in the moment. Brock silenced them all with his deep, rumbling voice. "We shall not rebel tonight. You need to conceal these spears until this week's end. Then, and only then, will we make our stand." The crowd quieted down, listening to their leader. "We rise not to exact vengeance on our enemies, but to liberate our friends. We rise not to vanquish our foes, but rescue our brethren. But make no mistake, we, Finn, rise, and when we do, the gods themselves will quake in fear of our name. We will march beneath the banner of the Steel Emperor, and we will know no fear." You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.